Welcome to The Debate. So, imagine unrolling a map of the world.
Right, and we're not talking about a modern map.
No, definitely not a modern one. With, neat borders, satellite imagery, and all that clean geometric certainty. Imagine unrolling a massive sheet of vellum from the late 13th century.
Like the famous Hereford Mappamundi?
Exactly like that. When your eyes move toward the edges of that map, you don't find empty oceans or some sterile grid. You find the edges completely teeming with life.
You find dragons. You find werewolves.
Yeah, and the Cyopodes, the people using one giant foot as an umbrella to shield themselves from the sun. And for centuries of European history, this wasn't fantasy. This was geography.
The boundary of the known world was essentially the boundary of reality itself. When you traveled far enough away from the center of civilization, the physical rules of nature didn't just bend, they entirely fractured.
Let's actually define what that means for our listeners, because we aren't just talking about bad cartography here. We are talking about an ontological boundary.
Right.
Meaning that the very nature of what it meant to exist, what it meant to be human or animal, fundamentally shifted the further you got from home. Today, we are stepping into that specific landscape.
The high medieval and early modern European understanding of wonders and monsters. So, roughly from the years 1150 to 1750.
Exactly. We are strictly examining the historical texts, the massive encyclopedias, and the incredible travelogues that documented these phenomena. And we're doing this to answer a fundamental question. What was the primary driver behind this intense, centuries-long fascination with the marvelous?
It really comes down to a fundamental disagreement about human motivation. Why were monks, kings, and merchants spending so much time and expensive ink documenting two-headed snakes and dog-headed men?
And that is exactly where we divide. I will be arguing that the medieval conception of wonders was inescapably theological. It was deeply rooted in normative moral frameworks. Wonders and monsters basically acted as strict boundaries for religious instruction.
A tool for fear, essentially.
Yes, they were divine warnings designed to regulate human behavior through awe and fear.
Well, I take a very different view of the material. I will be arguing that this massive catalog of wonders was actually an early expression of secular curiosity. It was driven by aesthetic pleasure, the psychological thrill of the exotic, and a genuine intellectually curious appreciation for the infinite diversity of the natural world.
Okay, so to grasp the theological foundation of this era, we really have to put ourselves in the mindset of a society heavily influenced by St. Augustine.
Right.
In this worldview, the universe was not just a collection of random biological or physical facts. The physical world was literally a book written by God.
And everything in it had a purpose.
Exactly. Everything in it was a sentence designed to teach a moral lesson. Wonders were primarily signs of God's absolute omnipotence. Like, if you read Augustine's City of God, he brings up phenomena like the eternal fires of Mount Etna.
Or the salamander?
Yes, the salamander, which people believed could live inside fire without burning. And he doesn't bring these things up because he's a curious biologist.
No, he brings them up to win a theological argument.
He uses them as a rhetorical bludgeon. Augustine uses the salamander to prove to skeptics that God can indeed make human bodies burn forever in hell without being consumed.
Wow.
Yeah, so the salamander is essentially a biological proof of concept for eternal damnation. Even the natural wonders were just exegetical tools to decode the Bible and enforce dogma.
Right.
Furthermore, when we look at individual biological anomalies, say a monstrous birth in a European village, the word monster itself comes from the Latin monstra, meaning to show or to warn. They were prodigies, urgent spiritual alarms, signaling divine wrath for a community's moral transgressions.
See, I look at the exact same timeline, but I see a completely different driving force. While the theological framework you mentioned was, the official party line, the true explosion of medieval writing on wonders was driven by human pleasure and novelty.
Pleasure? From a monster?
Yeah, the stuff people actually wanted to read. Take Gervase of Tilbury. In the early 13th century, he wrote a massive collection of wonders called the Otia Imperialia.
And he dedicated it to the Holy Roman Emperor, right?
Yes, to Otto IV. Now, these wonders weren't collected to make the emperor repent for his sins. They were collected for royal entertainment.
But entertainment in the 13th century usually came wrapped in a moralizing gloss. I mean, you didn't just read about a monster for fun without a priest standing there telling you what it symbolized.
Actually, Gervase explicitly resists that. Look at the specific wonders he chooses to highlight. He talks about the magnetic compass. He talks about local werewolf legends.
Right.
He even describes a magical bronze fly in Naples, supposedly built by the ancient poet Virgil, that just repelled all other flies from the city. Gervase openly connects the emotion of wonder to the psychological thrill of the rare and the unfamiliar.
So curiosity for its own sake.
Exactly. He writes that the human mind simply burns to hear novelties. This is the medieval equivalent of reading a thriller novel or going to a cabinet of curiosities. It's managed adrenaline. It wasn't about trembling before an angry god at all.
That is a very optimistic reading of the texts. But let me offer a different perspective by looking at how these wonders were mapped out geographically. I want to introduce a framework here for the listener.
Okay, lay it out.
Distance equals wonder, but proximity equals terror. To understand the purpose of wonders, we have to look at where the medieval mind placed them physically. Why are all these delightful marvels you mentioned pushed to the outermost edges of the known world?
Well, because the margins, places like the deepest reaches of India and Africa, represented a safe space for nature at play. The center of the world, meaning Europe and the Mediterranean, was rigidly structured by the church.
Highly civilized and strictly ordered.
Right, but the periphery was conceptually open. European writers who were influenced by ancient Roman naturalists like Pliny the Elder viewed the exotic races of the East with remarkable tolerance and delight.
You're talking about the monstrous races depicted on the Hereford map we discussed in the intro?
Yes, the Ceopodes with their umbrella feet were the Blemius, who were entirely headless and had their faces located in their chests. Pliny wrote that these varieties of the human race were made by the ingenuity of nature as toys for herself and marvels for us.
Toys for herself.
Yeah, and when Rustichello of Pisa co-wrote Marco Polo's travel accounts, he leaned heavily into this romance tradition. When Polo describes the margins of the map, these exotic creatures aren't viewed as a threatening alternative to European society.
They aren't.
No, they represent a highly positive, aestheticized variety of nature. It's an embrace of biological diversity, completely independent of theology.
I just don't see those margins as a playful playground of diversity. I see them as a moral funhouse mirror. The center of civilization simply could not tolerate the periphery existing in secular freedom. They felt an absolute need to spiritualize and moralize those distant margins.
How so? I mean, give me an example of how a headless man becomes a moral lesson.
Let's look at the Gesto Romanorum. This was a wildly popular compilation of tales from the late 13th century. It was essentially designed as a cheat sheet for preachers. They needed engaging stories for their sermons.
Sure.
The authors of this text didn't just look at the margins of the map and say, oh, look at this fascinating biological diversity. They took the Cynocephali, the mythical race of dog-headed men living in the East, and explicitly used them to symbolize ascetic preachers.
Wait, they turned a dog-headed monster into a priest?
Yes. They claimed the rough, animalistic nature of the dogmen represented a preacher wearing a rough hair shirt to mortify his flesh. Or they took the mythical Scythians, who supposedly had massive, oversized ears, and preached that those ears represented a pious willingness to hear the word of God.
Okay, I see.
So the exotic lands weren't secular explorations at all. They were theological allegories disguised as geography. The church took the weirdest things on the map and forced them to serve the pulpit.
I understand the Gesta Romanorum did that, but you have to consider the sheer volume travel literature that actively resisted that allegorical impulse. When Marco Polo describes the black lions or the pure white parrots of Quilon and India, he isn't attaching a Sunday sermon to them.
Right, he's just describing them.
He is totally overwhelmed by the aesthetic beauty. The rhetoric in his text is ecstatic, not didactic.
Well, Marco Polo was a merchant, which means his valuation of those parrots and lions was commercial.
That's just a different kind of dominance over the periphery. But let's test your theory about nature at play.
Go ahead.
If we accept your premise that the distant margins were this delightful playground, we have to address the second half of my framework. Distance might equal wonder, but what happens when the unnatural breaches the safety of the domestic center? How did medieval society react when the marvel wasn't 1,000 miles away in India, but was born in a local village?
The emotional reaction absolutely shifts based on proximity. I'll grant you that.
It shifts from curiosity to absolute existential horror. When a monster appeared at home, it was a prodigy, a terrifying rupture in the moral and physical order. Let's look deeply at the historical record.
Okay.
In the year 1317, conjoined twins were born in the city of Florence. They lived for about 20 days. This wasn't a mythological text. This was a highly documented civic event. Some locals actually proposed bringing the twins to the city priors, the ruling council, to show them off as a marvel.
And the priors refused?
The authorities actively barricaded the doors of the city palace. They kept the twins out.
Because a physical anomaly was viewed as a contagion.
Exactly. But a spiritual and political contagion. The authorities genuinely feared that the mere presence of this monster signified impending doom for the Republic. It wasn't biological curiosity, it was a political crisis.
Right.
Or take the historian Guibert of Nogent. He documents a two-headed baby born in 1116. In his writing, he immediately interprets this birth as a divine warning that directly presaged the bloody, violent revolt of the town of Laon that happened shortly after.
So the biology is immediately tied to human bloodshed.
The biology causes the dread of the bloodshed. And if you really want to see the stark difference between biological curiosity and moral horror, look at Gerald of Wales in the 12th century. He wrote extensively about the topography of Ireland.
The history and the wildlife.
Yeah, and at one point he describes a hybrid animal, a cross between a stag and a cow. His tone is mild, almost detached. It's just a biological quirk to him. But pages later, when he describes a woman having sexual relations with a goat and producing a hybrid, his text just erupts into absolute normative horror.
Because a boundary was crossed.
Yes. The core issue for medieval thinkers wasn't the biological mechanics of a hybrid. The terror came entirely from the moral violation of the boundaries God set.
That is a very powerful framework. But I fundamentally reject the idea that the dominant intellectual reaction remained trapped in that state of pure horror and divine retribution.
But we just saw it.
Yes, the lay public and the civic authorities in Florence panicked over conjoined twins. Panic is a standard human reaction to the unknown. But the intellectuals of the era were actively building tools to dismantle that superstitious panic.
What tools? The universities were entirely run by the church.
I am talking about the reintroduction of Aristotelian philosophy. Thinkers like the Dominican friar Thomas of Cantimpré in the 13th century were using Aristotle to drive a massive wedge between divine portents of doom and natural causal anomalies.
Oh, interesting.
Thomas of Cantimpré explicitly distinguishes between an exotic, stable species like the ansibina, a mythological snake that just naturally happens to have a head at each end, and a local, monstrous two-headed snake born in Europe.
Wait, let's break that down for a second. Let's translate this Aristotelian theory for the listener. What is the actual difference between an exotic species and a local monster in this context?
It comes down to mechanism. Before this, if a two-headed snake was born in your village, the assumption was that God specifically threw a lightning bolt of biological weirdness at you because you sinned.
Right, it was purely a divine message.
Exactly. But Thomas of Cantimpré uses Aristotle's theory of generation to provide a biological mechanism. He explains that the local two-headed snake isn't a demon. It isn't a warning of an impending bloody revolt. It is simply the mechanical result of two seeds being deposited in one uterus without a separating wall. It's a physical defect, a plumbing issue.
So you're arguing he is supplying a proto-scientific off-ramp.
He is stripping away the horror by supplying a mechanism. If a two-headed snake is a mechanical failure of the uterus, you study the uterus. If it's a thunderbolt of divine wrath, you drop to your knees, repent, and wait for the world to end.
That makes sense.
Right? By introducing material causes, intellectuals fundamentally change the human emotion from terror to inquiry.
I see the logic there, absolutely. but I think you are projecting modern scientific values onto a medieval monk.
How so?
The two seeds, and a final cause, which is God's ultimate purpose. Thomas of Cantimpré wasn't trying to secularize the world. Aristotelian physical causes were just the secondary mechanics that God used.
True, but
The fact that Thomas could explain the plumbing of a two-headed snake didn't negate his core belief that God ordained that specific plumbing to fail at that specific moment to serve as a warning. Finding the biological mechanism doesn't erase God's fingerprint.
it may not erase God's fingerprint, but it absolutely lowers the temperature of the panic. It makes the natural world readable through reason, not just through apocalyptic fear.
Well, let's test how readable it was by looking at who was actually consuming this knowledge. We've talked about these shifting perspectives, but let's look at the great encyclopedias of the 13th century that compiled all these marvels.
Sure.
I'm talking about the massive works by Vincent of Beauvais and Bartholomeus Anglicus. Who were these men, and who were they writing for?
They were compiling comprehensive overviews of all known properties of the world: animals, rocks, stars, human anatomy.
But they were Dominican and Cistercian friars. They were writing these massive multi-volume encyclopedias explicitly as textbooks for other friars.
Right.
Their stated goal was to aid preaching, to reform morals, and to help their colleagues understand scriptural enigmas. Bartholomeus Anglicus specifically stated his encyclopedia was a tool to help audiences decode the veiled symbols of the Bible.
I know, and Vincent of Beauvais organized his 32-book encyclopedia around the 6 days of divine creation.
Exactly. The entire epistemological architecture, the very way they organized knowledge, was designed to turn the natural world into a mirror of divine truth. They were monastic tools, thoroughly theological.
They started as monastic tools. I don't dispute their origins at all, but they didn't stay locked in the monasteries. And this is where my perspective really takes hold, because the audience demographics radically changed.
Over time, you mean?
Yes, as the centuries progressed, kings, aristocrats, and wealthy bourgeois readers wanted this information. They wanted to read about the dragons and the magnetic islands, but they didn't want the heavy, guilt-inducing theological baggage.
So they commissioned translations? Exactly. These massive friars' textbooks were finally translated into everyday vernacular languages. And when Bartholomeus' work was translated into French by a scholar named Jean Corbichon for the King of France, something fascinating happened.
What was that?
The religious exegetical prefaces, the parts that said, "Use this to preach about sin," were entirely stripped away. The text was rebranded as a secular encyclopedia of the world, totally devoid of the pulpit preaching mandate.
But removing a preface is just a cosmetic change. It doesn't alter the core substance of the text itself.
But the visual representation of the text changed too, and in a manuscript, the illumination dictates the meaning. Let's look at the famous 1413 Livre des Merveilles du Monde. It was illustrated by a highly skilled artist known as the Boucicaut Master.
Oh, I'm familiar with this. We talked earlier about the cynocephali, the dog-headed men. In the early medieval period, they were drawn as terrifying, ravening monsters or naked barbarians. Sometimes they were even shown eating people.
Very grim imagery.
Extremely. But in this 1413 manuscript, the Boucicaut Master paints the dog-headed men as urbane, fully clothed merchants. They are wearing lovely tunics. They are shown trading spices peacefully with European merchants, standing in front of castles that look exactly like contemporary French architecture.
So it's almost like a medieval PR campaign. They're taking the terrifying boogeyman from the edge of the map and dressing him in a French suit to make the idea of global trade palatable.
That is the perfect way to phrase it. It is a PR campaign for secular curiosity. It entirely neutralizes the dread. The visual language encapsulates the triumph of commercial curiosity over theological terror.
Fascinating.
The dog-headed man is no longer a symbol of sin or a terrifying monster. He's just a potential trading partner with a slightly unusual face. The wonder has been completely domesticated by commerce and aesthetic appreciation.
That is a striking image, I'll admit. But I have to push back on this narrative of a smooth, secular triumph. Even as they traded, even as they painted these elegant manuscripts, didn't the Europeans inherently believe in their own divine supremacy?
Well, they were definitely Eurocentric.
Right. It It's easy to paint a dog-headed man in French clothes on a page, but the underlying ideology of the people holding the book remained deeply hierarchical and religious. Let's look at an actual traveler, not just a painter in Paris. Consider Bishop Jordan of Severac.
The missionary who went to India.
Yes, he spent years traveling through India in the early 13th century. He writes back to Europe, and his letters are wildly enthusiastic about the boundless marvels of the East.
Right.
He praises the beauty, the variety of the animals, the incredible wealth. He sounds exactly like the curious, aesthetically pleased secular explorer you were describing. But how does he conclude his text?
He pivots back to his European identity.
He pivots hard. After pages of marveling at India, he suddenly concludes by defensively asserting that despite all these incredible wonders, Christendom remains vastly superior.
Because of religion.
He explicitly states it is because, and I quote, "we have the true faith." This proves that the aesthetic appreciation of natural diversity always hit a hard ceiling. The moment that diversity threatened the theological supremacy of Christian Europe, the boundary snapped aggressively back into place. Wonder was permissible, but only as long as it didn't challenge dogma.
You know, I actually think Jordan of Severac's defensiveness proves my point rather than yours.
Really?
Yeah. Why would a powerful bishop need to aggressively assert the superiority of Christendom out of nowhere? He only does it because the wonders of the East had genuinely challenged his worldview.
Ah, I see what you're saying.
The very fact that he felt the sudden need to clarify that Europe had the true faith shows that the aesthetic and cultural marvels of India had deeply moved him. They unsettled his baseline assumptions about European superiority. The curiosity was real, and it was potent enough to make a high-ranking religious official nervous.
That is a fascinating psychological interpretation. It suggests that wonder isn't just a passive emotion. It acts as a destabilizing force.
Exactly.
It's a cognitive passion that breaks boundaries, one that the religious authorities constantly had to wrangle back under their control.
Yes, it forces you to reconcile the reality of the world with the limits of your own philosophy.
Well, as we draw this discussion to a close, it is abundantly clear that we approach this vast historical landscape from two distinct vantage points. I maintain that the medieval wonder tradition, from the encyclopedias to the travelogues, was an enduring, highly structured mechanism. It was designed to define moral boundaries, decode the divine will, and basically maintain the theological order of a frightened universe.
And I maintain that the proliferation of these texts points to something far more modern. Wonders primarily satisfied a deep-seated, entirely human appetite for novelty, for pleasure, and for the aesthetic appreciation of natural diversity. An appetite that honestly simply outgrew its monastic confines.
Yet, despite our different framing of the underlying motives, we've arrived at a vital point of convergence today, and it anchors on that framework we explored earlier. Distance equals wonder. Proximity equals terror.
Right.
We both agree that marvels define the outermost limits of the known world, and by extension, the limits of the human mind. The geography of the unknown dictated the emotional response.
Absolutely. The exact same physical anomaly, a hybrid creature or a bizarre birth defect, could evoke delighted romantic curiosity if it was safely documented thousands of miles away in India.
Safe distance.
Yeah, but it provoked terrifying existential panic if it was born in the hospital down the street. Proximity is the absolute pivot point between wonder and horror.
It is a remarkable duality to consider. Reflecting on this, there is immense value in holding both of our perspectives simultaneously. Understanding that wonders acted simultaneously as terrifying divine warnings and delightful natural curiosities gives us a unique stereoscopic lens.
I agree completely.
It acts as a tool that suddenly illuminates a deeply shadowed landscape of the medieval mind.
It brings that lost world into 3 dimensions. It shows a society wrestling with its own fear and its own fascination, caught perpetually between the safety of the pulpit and the lure of the horizon.
There is certainly more to explore in this material. The rich literature of medieval topography holds countless more marvels, from petrifying springs that turn wood to stone, to massive magnetic islands that pull the nails out of passing ships, things we haven't even touched upon today.
It leaves a whole atlas of anomalies waiting to be unrolled.
Indeed. Think back to that massive medieval map we discussed at the very start. The teeming edges of that map aren't where knowledge stops. They are where a society's deepest values, fears, and desires are drawn in vivid, indelible ink. So when you look at the margins of your own understanding, do you see a warning or do you see an invitation?